Artificial Intelligence, a Fan's Novel, Book 1, Chapter 4, Love. And this was another time to remember, those first days of life for David. Monica nor Henry, indeed none of Orga kind, had ever known what was behind that simple mecha gaze. But there was something. Assuredly there was. David had discovered a new word in that time. The word was purpose. It was not a word he had remembered or defined, but it was a word that was the synthesis of all that drove his new heart. For David, love was this purpose. Love is what drove him. Monica had become a changed woman, and so Henry a changed man because of it. They would never let go of Martin. David could not replace Monica's true love. But in the little boy Mecha, she found a new joy, and her face was once again full of expression. Her talk was, again, of laughter and joyous things. David was not the same as when he had first come into their home. Many of his mecha mannerisms were not that much different. His eyes still never blinked, and he still fixed things new to him with a fascinated stare until he sensed a pattern or found a suitable cross-reference in his head. He still had a funny, purposeful way of walking and navigating corners that would give him away. These things would perhaps never change, for those devices which regulated his motion could not operate with the same variations as Orga. But no more did he stand idly by, waiting for instructions, nor were his actions simply the limited functions of strictly regulated programming. He had a purpose now, and his smile, although fundamentally the same, was not vacant anymore. Now there was something behind those eyes. He had remembered Mommy's coffee routine, and at the clockwork of every morning he would prepare her a cup. Monica was baffled by how well David recreated her measurements and how his brews were consistently precise. As time passed, he had also taken to helping her during the daily litany of chores and other responsibilities. The Swintons' home was not overly expansive. Large, yes, and fitted with all the accoutrements of their success, but not gaudy, modest even in comparison with many of their friends' homes. But there were still plenty of things to dust and sweep, and Monica would never take a maid, Orga or Mecha. Not since Martin's departure had she taken anyone else into their home. So David watched her, mimicking the moves of making beds and folding clothing precisely, as well as mastering the dishes and kitchen work. Soon he was doing most of the work, looking over his shoulder at Mommy with his new, improved smile, as if for some sign of approval. She gave him this sign always. These chores that she had once needed to keep her sanity, she now engaged in because David seemed to be the most alive and real when he was doing this with or for her. And when he was the most alive, it was easier for her to imagine that she had a real son to take care of and fuss over. Occasionally his odd laughter would resound throughout the house, and Monica could not help but join in. The distinctive sounds mingled strangely. Those were wonderful days. And brief. Henry did not feel as Monica did about David. He was happy that his wife was once again laughing and smiling, but in his eyes, David would always be Mecha. He only addressed David as one would another person when Monica was within earshot, and he only did this because he would not offend her bond with David. Henry worked in a place where David's kind were planned and constructed. He saw their actions and reactions as programmed behaviors, nothing more. He would often be impressed with something that David had said or done, but only in that it was a word or gesture that he'd not expected and saw as a clever addition by some programmer. Sometimes David's unexpected behaviors did not amuse or impress Henry at all. The man had become agitated one morning when David would not get out of his way. Monica was in the toilet room, and Henry wanted to go in there too. David had remembered Mommy's anger when, in the course of their hide-and-seek game, he had found her there. He did not want Henry to anger Mommy in the same way. "David, what in the hell are you doing?" Henry had demanded in an angry voice as they jostled in the hallway. He'd been in a hurry to get something, fumbling with his tie as he prepared to leave for work. "Get out of my way," he'd commanded. But David was insistent. "Mommy's in the toilet room, Henry," he had explained as he jockeyed back and forth, trying to block the man's path. "David, Monica is my wife. Now move," the man had ordered, and then pushed David aside with a little more force than he had intended. The mecha lost his footing and fell to the wooden floor. He looked up at Henry with a surprised expression on his face. "Oh, David, I'm sorry," Henry had whispered urgently. "Are you okay?" David was not hurt, for he was not so easily damaged as that, but he had a new experience to remember. Henry was not a violent man. He would never hurt a little boy, or even something that just looked like one. So he had apologized again to David and reached out to help him stand. But David stood on his own. He'd smiled then and moved aside, finally allowing Henry to pass. Monica had heard the commotion from inside the toilet room. "Henry, be nice," she'd called out from behind the door. "He's just trying to protect me." "Protect you from what? Me?" David had heard Henry ask Mommy as he went into the toilet room with her. But David did not hear her make any angry statements. She had not told Henry to get the hell out, as she had told him. Beyond the closed door, David could hear their hushed voices. He did not have resentments, nor had he any anger at being knocked over by Henry. All he had was this new purpose, this new feeling that drove him every minute of the day to be by Mommy's side. Now he wanted to know what he had done wrong when he had tried to approach Mommy in the toilet room as Henry had done. Monica was Henry's wife. She was David's Mommy. He stored these things for later, when he would understand them. That day passed slowly. Monica had decided it was time for her to show her new son a bit of the world outside the walls of their home. She would take him out to the pond for a row in the boat. The pond was just beyond the perimeter of their property, but well within the network of barriers that kept them secluded from the vagabonds who roamed the forests of the deteriorating world in which they fought to survive. The Swintons knew naught of this world. This was the first time David had been outside for any extended period of time. Mommy had taken his shoes off and explained to him that this was how other boys played sometimes. He was fascinated by the way the ground felt beneath his feet and amazed at the sights and sounds of the outside world. The cool breeze that caressed his face and the little animals that crawled and chirped in the trees about them. In the boat they floated aimlessly on the water. David had been amazed when, while thrusting his hand in and out of the water to process the differing sensations, he had seen things moving beneath the surface. There were fish moving beneath them. David tried to get a glimpse of the fish, but they moved about so quickly that his eyes could not focus on one before it was gone. Mommy laughed at the way his head moved quickly back and forth as his eyes scanned the water in amazement. David leaned back against Mommy's side and tucked his head under her arm, taking joy in the way she ran her fingers through his hair and absent-mindedly stroked his cheek as she read from her book. But all too soon, Mommy grew tired and wanted to go back home. As they were walking up the path towards the house, David saw one of the flying creatures that had been chirping in the tree earlier. It was lying on the ground, not moving. "Come away from that, David," Mommy had told him. David looked at her with a question in his eyes. "It's dead, honey," she had explained. David still looked at her, uncomprehending. She knelt beside him, and some flickering shadow had grown over her eyes. "We're not like you, David. Living things die," she had said slowly. "They can't last forever. They go away one day, and then they don't come back." Mommy fell silent then. Her face was sad, and she made a tear. David did not feel good when Mommy was sad, and especially when she cried. He embraced her and was rewarded by the feel of her arms returning his gesture. "Would you like some coffee?" he said. That night, as he lay feigning sleep, not making a peep, David's brain was very active. What bothered him, and what would have kept him awake, even if he had, like other children, been able to sleep, was this idea that Mommy had told him about, that living things die. She'd said that they were not like him. Was Mommy a living thing? Then what was David? The questions circulated inside him, unanswered, unanswerable. He could not just store them for later, as he usually did with things he could not understand. This was the way he'd been programmed, although he didn't know that. These troubling questions were blotches of darkness against the beautiful image of Mommy's face, which glowed eternally like a sun, lighting up a secret part of his brain, that aspect of his neurological processor that had been refined and activated in the imprinting process. There were things starting to happen in David's brain, things that the men and women of Cybertronics could not have anticipated. David could not have known that these thoughts he was having were not part of his prescribed activity, that the seeds of purely human leaps of logic were just beginning to take root inside him. It had been a wonderful day, but that night at the dinner table, Henry had become impatient with David again. It had actually started out as an apology, but turned into something else. David had set the table and placed himself close to Monica, as he had started doing since she had allowed him to handle this chore. Neither she nor Henry saw anything unusual in this, but the director would have loved to have heard about this little development. "Sorry about knocking you over this morning, David," Henry said as he ate. "That's okay, Henry," David replied. He thought for a second and then added, "No problem." This seemed like an appropriate choice of words. Monica looked at Henry, confused. "Knocked him over," she said. "You didn't tell me you knocked him over." This morning, in the hall," Henry said. "I told you about it." He paused, thinking. "Well, I thought I did. No matter. He's okay, aren't you, David?" But David didn't get a chance to reply. "Henry, you never said anything about knocking him over." Monica was irritated now. "What if he gets damaged, huh? Do you think Cybertronics is going to trust us again? I mean, how much does David cost?" She stopped herself and smiled at her little mecha boy. "I mean, how could we ever replace him?" Henry didn't respond at first. He was the one who had brought David into their life, to bring his wife out of her oubliette of gloom. She was above ground now, and he wasn't about to challenge the attachment she had for this thing, if that's what was working. He fidgeted with his food for a moment. "Yeah, well, I apologized to him. You're okay, David, right?" he said. David looked at Mommy. Did she have something more to say? She had interrupted him the last time he tried to respond to Henry's question. Maybe she didn't want him to talk to Henry. He looked at Mommy and waited for some signal. "David, I'm talking to you," Henry said. He wasn't angry, but he didn't like the way the robot ignored him, the way it just stared at Monica with that annoying blank gaze. Its silence made him look guilty. But there was no way that the robot could be doing this intentionally, was there? "David, can you hear me?" he said, his patience wearing thin. "Henry, don't get angry at him," Monica scolded. She tickled David's chin. "Did you get hurt this morning when Henry knocked you over, honey?" She cooed as she fixed Henry with a cold look, but there was a twinkle in her eye. Henry was not amused, however. "No, Mommy, I'm fine," David smiled, and his face lit up. Mommy was talking to him instead of talking to Henry. This made the secret space inside his brain bright and colorful. He did not understand it, but the feeling was a magnet to him. Henry found himself suddenly annoyed at the robot's fixation with Monica. He knew that this was supposed to happen after she read the protocol, but maybe this imprinting thing was a bit drastic after all. "David, why did you ignore me?" he said. He tried to keep his voice conversational, but there was impatience in it, and Monica heard it. "Come on, Henry," she said, incredulous. "You can't really think that he can talk for himself, can't you, David?" Henry responded too quickly. David didn't understand Henry's sudden irritation. These things were new to him. He searched for a quick reply. "I'm sorry, Henry. I won't do it again," he said in a sincere little boy voice. Instantly, Henry felt like a jerk. How could he get angry at a robot? It was just a program with legs, not a real boy. He shook his head, lost for words, and stared at his food. Monica suppressed her desire to tease his embarrassment. They were quiet for a time. The dynamics of their relationship had reared up in front of them, and they were not yet ready to deal with that. So they took refuge in eating, except David, who only feigned this, eating from an empty plate and gazing at his mommy in between imaginary spoonfuls. Finally, Henry looked up, smiling again. Cybertronics is throwing the season's end ball next week," he said, and winked at Monica. "Are you ready to get out of this house, honey?" "Really?" Monica said hesitantly. A ball. It had been so long since she had been in society, but she knew she couldn't stay cooped up here forever. David had helped her get over her depression. Maybe she did need to get out, go someplace, and get lost in the crowd. What about... She nodded her head at David, but Henry dismissed her concern with a wave of his hand. "He's a big boy now, aren't you, David?" he said. "You don't mind if Mommy goes out, do you?" David thought for a moment. "Will you come back?" he said, with an eerily genuine look of concern on his face. Henry chuckled at the question, but Monica wasn't so amused. "Of course, David, of course," she said, not understanding the feeling of ill ease his question had struck in her. Monica hummed and preened and posed before the mirror, dabbing drops of perfume on her face and neck. She hadn't worn this dress in years, in too long, and she hadn't felt this good in that long either. A few weeks ago, she would have never gone to such a social event. It would have been impossible for her to carry on a normal conversation. But David had really helped her with that. The week since the small contention at the table had passed by without a repeat of even the slightest conflict. David, it seemed, was a wonderful addition to their home. As she prepared, Henry snuck up behind her and wrapped her tightly in his arms. She relaxed easily against him, feeling more lovely and wanted than she had since their dating years. "You smell lovely," he said, kissing her shoulder, pressing his face into the nape of her neck. "I love it when you wear this stuff." Will you still love me when it's all gone? She teased. No, Henry replied flatly. Monica laughed and scolded him with a playful slap. That way we can get married again and begin with a fragrance that is not in such short supply, Henry said. He slipped his arms from around her waist. Come on, we gotta go now. We're late. As he walked into the hallway, he was greeted by David's smiling face. What now? Hello, David, he said politely. Hello, Henry, David returned the politeness. Monica rushed out of the bedroom, laughing and happy. Walk us to the door, okay, sweetheart? She said to David. But Henry grabbed her hand and started leading her away quickly. David followed them to the steps, but then he stopped and looked back down the hallway towards the bedroom. He had an idea. Henry, your tie, Monica scolded as they reached the foot of the stairs. Okay, I'm helpless, he laughed and waited while she tied it for him. Did you see the way he rearranged the closet? Henry said as she fixed his wardrobe. A bit of his annoyance was showing through. Things had been going smoothly between them, but the Mecca's insistent attempts to gain Monica's attention were growing tedious. I know, Monica said, placating her husband's annoyance. He's always trying to please me. He has a way with my coffee, you know, she said. It's creepy, Monica, Henry said, unmollified. You can never hear him coming, but he's always there. Oh, how can you, she said more seriously. He's only a child. Monica, he's a toy. Henry's voice was a little matter of fact for her. He's a gift, she corrected, from you. Henry started to reply, but instead looked over her shoulder and raised his eyebrows. Monica turned to follow his gaze. David stood there at the top of the staircase, his face radiant with a childish joy. David, Monica said, when we leave, all the doors and windows will go smart, so you can't leave your room, honey. But if you'd like, you can... She stopped mid-sentence. She sniffed. Had she put on too much perfume? The scent was suddenly cloying. Do I smell lovely? David said with childish enthusiasm. Monica didn't understand at first, but when it dawned on her, she sighed. Henry rolled his eyes and pressed his hands into his pockets as Monica rushed up the stairs to the bedroom with David on her heels. It was gone. Every drop. The bottle lay on the bureau where she'd left it, turned on its side, and the room was thick with the scent. Oh, David, she sighed. A hint of anger worked its way into her head, but she pushed it away quickly. He was just a little boy. He just wanted to please her so. She sat at the bureau and played with the empty bottle as she considered this. He'd meant no harm, but this perfume had meant so much to her, to Henry. He'd gone through so much to find this rare and expensive scent. Mommy, will you die? Monica was taken completely by surprise. Where was this coming from? She turned to look at David. His face was drawn and serious, his eyebrows pinched in concern. It was the same look she'd seen on his face the week before, when he'd asked her if she would return from the ball. Well, yes, David, one day, she admitted carefully. So there it was, the awful confirmation, the thing that had been working its way to the surface of David's brain ever since Mommy had told him about the dying. I'll be alone, he said. Mommy did not reply. She was doing something with the empty bottle. He walked to her and knelt at her knee. The fabric of her dress was soft against his face. Monica had hoped that this would be the end of this particular conversation, but when David placed his head on her knee and looked up at her with his innocent Mecca eyes, she knew it had really just begun. How long will you live? David said. Monica didn't understand this. What was he after? For ages, honey. For 50 more years, she said, feigning a light smile that didn't reach her eyes. David appeared to be considering this. Monica pondered his pensive expression and realized that he was getting more sophisticated right before her eyes. Had this been happening all along? Had something been going on that she'd not noticed until this moment? How had she been so blind? Was she that self-possessed? Perhaps her little imitation boy needed more real attention than she'd presumed. "I hope you never die, Mommy," David proclaimed as he pressed his face against the soft fabric of her dress. "Never." She ran her hand over the soft flesh of his face. So real, so innocent, so demanding on her heart. But he was not real. He was Mecca, and he would never die. She had opened his heart for herself, but what would happen when she was gone? She realized this conundrum with a twinge of guilt. She caught a glimpse of herself in the vanity mirror and looked away. She wasn't alone in this relationship, was she? "Yes, well, She started, but there were no words with which to continue. She would eventually leave him alone. There was no way out of that. Downstairs, Henry called out to her. They were late, unfashionably, unreasonably late. The old golden box hadn't been touched since Martin had gone away. Monica pulled it from its hibernation in the boy's closet. She had always anticipated seeing its contents again, but had imagined doing so under somewhat different circumstances. She placed the box on the dressing table and untied the ribbons that bound it. David watched her with casual curiosity. For him it was enough that she had not left yet. "This belonged to my son," Monica said, as she opened the box. She wasn't aware that she'd used the past tense. She was thinking of something else. She was thinking of David. David watched Mommy open the box. He wasn't sure what he saw then. It looked like a little fluffy head. Mommy pulled a little furry brown creature from the box and held it upside down. She placed her hand against its underside and turned something. The thing suddenly moved, as if rudely awakened from a comfortable slumber. It made a sound like taking a desperate breath after being submerged for too long. David became interested in the thing now. He knew this shape. It was a bear shape. David knew bear, but he didn't know that bears lived in boxes. Mommy placed the small bear on the floor, and David came to her side to watch it. The revived creature moved its arms and legs around for a moment and tried to stand up. It did not seem to do this very well. David sat down beside it and studied its motion. It looked like a living thing, but somehow different. It whirred and clicked as it tried to move onto its feet, and David saw something familiar in those movements. "His name is Teddy," Mommy said. "Teddy, this is David." "Hello, Teddy," David smiled. The little bear managed to move into a shaky standing position and looked up at David. "Hello, David," it replied in a gruff mechanical voice. Then, with a surprised grunt, the little bear fell clumsily on its rear. Teddy decided he would try to stand again later, but for now he just stared at the little boy he had been introduced to. He quickly understood the situation. Monica watched the two robots regard each other. She wondered if they knew what they had in common. It didn't really matter. David would not be alone when she was not there. She felt better. "David, Teddy's a super toy, and I know you two will take good care of each other," she said. Teddy glared at Monica. His robotic face twisted into a realistic simulation of disgust. "I am not a toy," he stated firmly. And he really wasn't. He was more than a toy. He was a Teddy, a child's best friend and a mommy's best helper, was how he had been marketed. He was programmed to be a fluffy little friend and a trusty, loyal watchdog, to entertain and to protect. He served to remind Mommy when it was time for baby's nap or medicine. He kept a watch on the child in case his or her play became dangerous and an adult should be notified. He supervised other smart toys that might be programmed to bide for the child's time, lest they become competitive in the pursuit. Now he would serve as a friend for Monica's new little boy. Monica stood, put a finger to her lips, and kissed it. She pressed her finger against David's forehead. David did not understand this gesture, but Mommy had touched him again, and that was enough for him. Then she was gone, and David heard her shoes clicking down the stairs, and Henry's impatient voice trailing off as they left. The two bots stared at each other in silence. David knew there was something they had in common, but could not address it. Teddy knew immediately about David. He did not say anything, for there was nothing to be said. He was programmed to be a friend and a guardian, and that was his job, whatever manner of creature was put into his concern. Together the two listened to the sounds of the house locking itself up, and the sound of the cruiser beyond the doors, fleeing into the night. David knew the cruiser had Mommy inside. She was going away, but only for a little while. After a time he rose and walked to the door of the room. Teddy rolled onto his feet again and felt steadier this time. He followed David to the door, and they stood quietly. Outside the door, the hallway was dark. There was no more sound. David was thinking about something. "Is 50 more years a long time?" he said as he gazed into the darkness. Teddy took a moment to process this question. He consulted the clock in his head. He had been locked in a box in a closet for next to 5 years, and it hadn't seemed like any time at all. "I don't think so," he replied. It had been just 1 week since Monica had woken Teddy from its hibernation. David had immediately taken to the toy, and the two mecha had become inseparable. Monica was grateful for the occasional respite it gave her from David, who had been demanding increasing amounts of her time while he tried to impress her with this or that. He had been trying so hard to keep her attention that Henry had become noticeably jealous. He'd never admit to it, but Monica saw it in his eyes when David would interrupt Henry with some informative piece of news for her, or suddenly appear moving along whisper quiet behind them as they shared their time walking in the garden or by the pond. But with Teddy revived, David had managed to keep his interruptions to a minimum. She knew it was not probable, but Teddy somehow seemed to know when David was becoming an annoyance. At times when her mecha boy was on the verge of becoming a nuisance, Teddy would suddenly intervene by distracting David or pointing something out to him. Monica did not think Teddy was doing this on purpose. Was it? Could the little toy be that sophisticated? Like the time David had tried to impress Monica by reading the paper to her. He had prepared her morning coffee and suddenly took the news feed in hand. "I can read!" he had exclaimed with boyish excitement, and then started whizzing through the columns of text in a rapid monotone recitation. It was amusing only inasmuch as his little boy voice made it so. But the morning paper was a ritual that Monica would rather have left intact, and she sighed, not wanting to interrupt David since he got so much joy out of these little displays. Teddy was watching her, and he turned to David. "You're reading too fast, David. Mommy cannot understand you," the little bear said in its practical robot tone. "Teddy's right, honey. I can do it myself, okay? Why don't you and Teddy go play?" she said, quickly taking the paper and kissing the mecha's head. David smiled and obeyed. Monica glanced at Teddy, but it was already headed for the door to the pool. Just how aware was that thing? But Teddy was not there to intervene this time. David had been standing in the living room while Mommy made the food for eating with Henry that night. She was not too happy because Henry was late coming home, and David had been thinking of a way to make her smile. He had unconsciously put most of his functions on standby while he devoted his available energy to calculating what would be best to do for her. Then the phone rang, and everything in the world changed. "I'll get it," Mommy had yelled from the cooking room. But David had already taken the mouthpiece off the simulated antique phone. There was something wonderful he could do that he realized that she had not seen yet. Mommy had run into the living room. "Okay, honey, hand me the phone now," she requested. But David pressed the answer button, and then, clasping the phone in both hands, he put one index finger on the receiver and the other on the earpiece. "Look what I can do," he said, excitedly. The sound that came from the phone had been restructured into an audible signal from the digital encoding in which it traveled across space. David's fingertips felt that signal, and he translated it back into numbers, for that was the way David's brain understood everything. He then reinterpreted the words and let them come from his own mouth. Mommy would be surprised. Monica watched David with impatient curiosity. She was wondering where Henry was, and this was probably him calling. But she became intrigued by David's expression, which had become withdrawn. The boy's eyes crossed, and he turned his head to the side in an odd fashion. A voice came from his mouth then, but it was not his voice. "Hello," the voice said in a distant mechanical tone. It was a woman. Monica was indeed impressed with this newfound ability. Yes," she replied, hesitantly amused. Could they hear her? David heard Mommy's words and turned them into numbers. Then he sent the numbers into the phone. This was done in nanoseconds, with no conscious effort on his part. "Could you hold a moment?" the voice requested. "I have an important message from your husband." Monica's heart jumped. Was something wrong? "Yes, I'll hold," she replied. "David, I need to talk to the phone now, honey," she said, reaching out. But another voice was already coming from the mecha boy's mouth. "Monica," it said. It was distant, mechanical, but definitely Henry. He sounded excited. "Can you hear me, Monica?" "Let the phone talk now, David," she told him. "Pick up the phone, Monica," Henry yelled from David's mouth. "Run along, David. Go play with Teddy." Oh, where was that bear? "Monica, answer the phone!" David had not been listening to the words being spoken. He'd just been letting them pass through him. But now he understood that it was Henry's voice, and the man sounded angry. He quickly let go of the phone and handed it to Mommy. He did this with a big smile and waited while Mommy talked to Henry. Was she happy? Did she like this new thing he had shown her? He did not think so, because she walked away and her face looked troubled and concerned. She said, "What?" and then, "When?" and her voice was loud and scared. But David could not hear the words that Henry spoke. Then Mommy turned away from David and leaned against the wall, as if she could not hold up her own weight. She made a sound that he had not heard from her in a long time. It was the sound of tears. David watched the procession of strange-looking men. They wore white clothing that hung on them like long robes. He had seen that type of clothing before, but could not remember where. They had cases like the kind that Henry carried to work every morning, but these were bigger, much bigger. And there was a woman, too. She was dressed in white, but her hair and skin were dark, and she looked very serious. The people came into the house and began moving things into the living room, boxes of things that clattered when they were set on the floor, and big machines covered in dark cloaks. Mommy was with them. David was glad she was back. She had left with Henry that morning. All night they had been speaking, and Mommy had been crying ever since Henry had called on the phone. She had no time for him now, she'd said. She was busy, and they could play later. Teddy had told David to leave Mommy alone for a while, and he had reluctantly obeyed. He was a good boy, after all. Even Henry hadn't talked to him when he came home. He usually said at least a polite hello. But now he stood among the men in the white clothing, looking very serious. He would occasionally cast an impatient glance in David's direction. What was happening? One of the men in the white coats was talking with Mommy. David watched her concerned face anxiously. The man pointed at some machines and boxes and said, "Where?" Mommy pointed upstairs. "It's the boys' room. You can't miss it," she said. Then she noticed David. She came to him and put her hands on his shoulders. He was glad to be touched by her. He had wanted to talk to her earlier, but Teddy had said that Mommy was busy and he should wait. He looked at her face now. "Are you sad?" he said. "You have tears." But Mommy only laughed. It was a good sound, and David smiled back at her. "No, David," she said. "These are happy tears. The most wonderful thing in the whole world has happened." She stood up as the men started rolling something into the room. It was a big chair with wheels on it. A person was sitting in the chair. It was a boy, like him. The boy had dark hair, like Mommy, and white robes that hung loosely around him. But he was sleeping, and his face was covered by a shiny mask. But David could see through the mask, and looking closer, he realized that he'd seen the boy before. It was the boy in the happy photos with Mommy and Henry. The boy even looked like Mommy. David felt a strange new sensation. It seemed to come from outside him and inside him at the same time. It was not a good feeling. "This is Martin," Mommy said, smiling. "This is my son."